Everyone laughed when she picked up her phone to call. Minutes later, the video call left them shocked. Washington, D.C. wakes up like a machine built on decisions. At dawn, the city glows in soft gold, marble monuments catching the first light, government buildings standing silent and imposing, flags barely stirring in the early morning air. Power lives here. Influence breathes here. Careers are built and buried here before lunch. 16 floors above K Street, inside a tower of glass and steel, another kind of power is preparing to move. Jessica Thompson steps out of the elevator at 6:42 a.m. The hallway is quiet, the carpet thick enough to swallow sound. Floor-to-ceiling windows frame the Capitol dome in the distance, a reminder that oversight and authority are woven into this city's DNA. She pauses for half a second, smoothing the sleeve of her navy blazer, steadying her breathing. Today is her first major investor presentation as senior financial analyst. The promotion had come 3 months ago. It had been framed as recognition, and it was. But it had also come with longer nights, tighter deadlines, and a new, subtle pressure she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just running numbers, she was validating strategy, and strategy belonged to Jonathan. She walks into the executive conference room, light still dimmed. The table is a long slab of dark walnut, polished to a mirror sheen. At the far end, a massive screen waits. Leather chairs sit in precise symmetry, as if even they understand hierarchy. Jessica sets down her leather folder and lays out printed financial sheets, color-coded tabs, annotated margins, small pencil marks only she would notice. She had reviewed Project Horizon until nearly midnight. Twice. Jonathan arrives at 7:05 a.m., and precisely as he always does, not early enough to appear anxious, not late enough to seem careless. He moves with the confidence of someone who knows how rooms react to him. Tall, composed, tailored charcoal suit. His handshake is firm but measured, his smile warm but never excessive. Investors trust him, the board trusts him, the press calls him visionary. "Morning, Jessica," he says smoothly, placing his tablet at the head of the table. "Good morning." His eyes flick briefly to her stack of printed materials. "You ready for this?" "Yes," she replies. "It's the truth, mostly." By 8 a.m., the room fills. CFO, head of strategy, legal counsel, 2 vice presidents, 3 external investors representing a private equity consortium, 1 institutional fund manager dialing in remotely. Coffee is poured, polite laughter circulates, the atmosphere is controlled optimism. Jonathan stands. "Thank you all for being here," he begins, voice steady and resonant. "Today marks a pivotal step forward for our organization." The screen lights up. Project Horizon, a sleek logo, a forward arrow embedded in the typography. This initiative positions us for aggressive expansion across 3 emerging markets, Jonathan continues. We're looking at projected revenue growth exceeding 28% year over year. Slides advance. Graphs climb sharply upward. Margins widen. Forward-looking earnings accelerate. Jessica follows along, her printed packet aligned with the digital presentation. Everything looks impressive, everything looks airtight. And then she sees it again, page 14 of her packet, revenue breakdown by segment. She narrows her eyes slightly. Line item Q4 enterprise contracts, $42.6 million recognized. Below it, smaller notation, pending final signature. Her pencil taps once against the paper. That can't be right. She flips back 2 pages, cross-references the deferred revenue schedule, then forward again. The revenue is fully recognized in this quarter's projection, but the contracts are not finalized. A faint pulse starts behind her ears. Maybe it's a timing placeholder, she thinks. Maybe legal confirmation came through after this draft. Jonathan continues speaking, confident and fluid. Our forecasting model incorporates secured commitments already negotiated at the executive level. Jessica scans the footnotes. Secured commitments is not the same as executed contracts. She leans closer, rereading the accounting summary. Revenue recognition policy, recognized upon contractual obligation and performance criteria initiation. If the contracts are pending signature, there is no contractual obligation. Her stomach tightens. She opens her laptop silently and pulls up the internal contract tracker. Status column, pending final signature. All 3 major enterprise deals, still pending. Jessica feels a strange dual sensation, heat rising in her chest, cold settling into her fingertips. This isn't a rounding discrepancy. It's not a projection assumption. It's premature revenue recognition. She forces herself to breathe evenly. Jonathan clicks to the final slide. With these numbers, he says, we are prepared to execute final approval today and begin implementation immediately. A murmur of approval moves around the table. One investor nods. Another scribbles notes. Jessica hears the words final approval echo in her head. If this passes today, those numbers become public guidance. If those contracts don't materialize, the implications ripple outward. Regulatory scrutiny, investor backlash, reputational damage, or worse. Maybe Jonathan knows something she doesn't. Maybe signatures are minutes away. Maybe she's over-analyzing. Her promotion flashes through her mind, the congratulations email, the handshake from Jonathan himself. You've earned this. And now, stay quiet, protect your seat at the table, or speak, and risk being seen as inexperienced. Jonathan looks toward the investors. Unless there are any final questions, we'll proceed with execution. The room stills. Jessica hears her own heartbeat. This is the moment. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't clear her throat dramatically. She simply speaks. I recommend we conduct an external audit before final execution. The words hang in the air like something fragile. Silence follows. It isn't loud. It's dense. Jonathan turns his head slowly. He smiles, but the smile doesn't reach his eyes. An audit? He repeats lightly. Jessica, could you clarify what concern you're addressing? His tone is pleasant, curious, public. She keeps her posture straight. The Q4 enterprise contracts listed on page 14 are recorded as recognized revenue, she says evenly. However, they're currently marked as pending final signature. Under standard accounting principles, revenue recognition typically requires contractual obligation. A shift in the room. Chairs creak slightly. One investor leans forward. Jonathan nods once, as if humoring a thoughtful intern. I appreciate the diligence, he says smoothly, but those contracts are secured at the executive level. We anticipate final signatures imminently. Anticipated signatures are not executed contracts, Jessica replies. Not aggressive, not emotional, just factual. Jonathan's smile tightens. I think what Jessica is demonstrating, he says, turning slightly toward the investors, is admirable caution. She's recently stepped into a broader forecasting role, and sometimes it takes time to adjust to strategic modeling at scale. A few soft chuckles. Heat rises behind Jessica's ears. I'm not questioning strategic modeling, she says calmly. I'm questioning recognition timing. Jonathan tilts his head. There's a difference between caution and paralysis, he replies. In high-growth environments, overcautiousness can look like a lack of alignment. There it is. Overcautious, lack of alignment. The phrases land precisely. One investor glances between them. Jessica feels the room recalibrating, not around the numbers, but around hierarchy. She opens her packet again. Revenue appears to be recognized prior to contractual obligation, she says, steady. An external audit would validate our position and protect the company before public execution. Jonathan's expression hardens for the first time. "We don't need an audit to confirm what we already know," he says. "Our internal controls are sufficient." He clicks the remote. The slide advances as if the matter is closed, but the atmosphere has shifted. The polish has cracked, just slightly. Investors exchange glances, now not just of enthusiasm, but of calculation. Jessica sits back slowly. Her pulse is steady again. Jonathan resumes his presentation, voice measured, confidence restored on the surface, yet something invisible has entered the room. A fracture, small, but real. Jessica looks down at the contract tracker still open on her laptop. Pending, pending, pending. She senses with quiet certainty that this isn't a misunderstanding, and it isn't a simple forecasting difference. Something larger is moving beneath the surface of Project Horizon. The meeting continues, but the balance in the room has shifted, and Jessica knows, whether anyone else does yet or not, that this is only the beginning. By the time Jonathan advances to the next slide, the air in the room feels thinner. No one says it out loud, but everyone feels it. The subtle shift, the warmth that had filled the conference room earlier is gone. In its place is something sharper, watchful. Jonathan stands at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood, the other holding the presentation remote like a conductor's baton. "As I was saying," he continues smoothly, "Project Horizon represents a defining moment for this organization." His tone is steady again, controlled, but there's a new edge beneath it. Jessica sits upright, hands folded loosely over her printed packet. Her expression is neutral, but her senses are heightened. She can feel eyes glancing toward her, then quickly away. Jonathan clicks to a slide showing projected expansion across 3 regions. "Innovation requires decisiveness," he says. "It requires confidence in our models and in our leadership." He pauses just long enough. "And it requires freedom from fear-based thinking." The phrase lands deliberately. A few investors nod, almost reflexively. Jonathan turns slightly, as if addressing the room at large. Not Jessica directly. In high-growth markets, hesitation can cost opportunity. Resistance to forward movement can stall momentum. Jessica hears the reframing happening in real time. Her concern is no longer about accounting standards. It's about fear. It's about resistance. It's about momentum. Jonathan looks toward one of the private equity partners. "We brought Jessica into senior forecasting because we value fresh perspective," he says with a thin smile. "But transitioning from analytical review to strategic execution is a learning curve." A faint murmur of understanding ripples around the table. Jessica feels the subtle shift again, sympathy tilting toward Jonathan now. He isn't dismissing her. He's mentoring her, correcting her. She keeps her posture steady. Inside, her pulse is pounding hard enough that she can feel it in her fingertips. Jonathan walks slowly along the length of the table. "Let's be clear," he says, voice lowering slightly. "The contracts in question are secured at the executive level. The signatures are procedural." He stops. "But when internal doubt is introduced at this stage, in front of investors, it signals uncertainty." He lets that sit. Uncertainty. In Washington, uncertainty is weakness. One investor leans back, folding his arms. Another glances at the projected revenue slide again, as if recalculating risk. Jessica speaks carefully. "My intention wasn't to introduce doubt," she says. "It was to ensure compliance before execution." Jonathan turns toward her fully now. "And compliance," he says, "is already embedded in our internal controls." His eyes lock onto hers. "When we elevate someone into a leadership role, we expect alignment with strategic direction." There it is again, alignment. The word sounds cooperative. In this room it feels like a warning. Jessica senses it clearly now. This is no longer about revenue recognition. This is about authority. Jonathan shifts his gaze back to the investors. Decisive leadership cannot be slowed by internal hesitation, he says, especially at a moment like this. Silence presses in. Jessica feels it tightening around her. Jonathan walks back to the head of the table. He places the remote down, and then he does something no one expects. He presses the intercom button on the conference table. "Could HR join us in the boardroom, please?" he says calmly. For a split second, no one reacts. Jessica's breath catches, not in panic, but in recognition. He's escalating. The door opens less than a minute later. Two HR representatives step inside, confused but composed. They had clearly not expected to enter a live investor meeting. Jonathan gestures toward the far end of the table. "Thank you for coming on short notice," he says. "We have a personnel matter to address." The investors sit very still now. The executive team avoids eye contact. Jonathan turns toward Jessica. "Effective leadership requires cohesion," he says, voice even. "Public contradiction at critical execution points damages organizational momentum," he pauses, "and demonstrates misalignment with leadership direction." Jessica feels every eye in the room settle on her. Her body is perfectly still, no tremor, no outward reaction. "For that reason," Jonathan continues, "we've decided to terminate Jessica's employment, effective immediately." The words are clean, clinical, final. One of the HR representatives shifts uncomfortably. An investor blinks, surprised. Another executive lowers his gaze, jaw tight. Jonathan continues as if reading from a prepared script. "HR will formalize the paperwork. We thank Jessica for her contributions and wish her the best in her future endeavors." The humiliation is precise, not emotional, not explosive, surgical. Jessica feels a wave of heat move through her body, then pass. This was always a possibility. She stands slowly. No tears. No protest, no raised voice. The room waits for a reaction. It doesn't come. Jonathan picks up the remote again. "Now," he says smoothly, "as I was outlining, Horizon positions us for immediate acceleration." The slide changes. Revenue curves climb confidently upward. The meeting resumes, as if nothing happened. Jessica remains standing for a moment longer. Then she calmly gathers her folder. Her phone rests beside it on the table. She picks it up. A whisper travels down the table. "She's calling someone." A soft, barely contained laugh from one of the junior executives. The assumption is obvious. She's calling for help, for damage control, for a ride home. Jonathan glances at her, and for the first time since the meeting began, there is open satisfaction in his expression, a smirk, controlled but unmistakable. Jessica unlocks her phone. Her fingers move with deliberate precision. She does not rush. "Is there anything else?" Jonathan asks coolly, not looking directly at her. "Yes," Jessica replies. The single word cuts through the room. She turns toward the IT manager seated near the wall. "Can you connect my phone to the screen, please?" The request lands like a dropped glass. A few eyebrows rise. Jonathan's smirk deepens slightly. "Jessica," he says, tone indulgent, "this isn't necessary." "I believe it is," she answers. Her voice is steady. The IT manager hesitates, glancing at Jonathan. Jonathan exhales slowly, as if amused. "Go ahead," he says. "Let's be efficient." The IT manager stands, walks over, and accepts Jessica's phone. A cable is connected. The screen flickers. Jonathan folds his arms. Several investors lean forward now, curiosity replacing discomfort. The display shifts from the Horizon slide to a mirrored phone screen. An incoming video call is active. The room goes quiet. Jessica nods once at the IT manager. "Please put it on speaker." The screen stabilizes. The caller ID fills the center of the massive display. Incoming video call, Thomas Caldwell. For a heartbeat, no one moves. No one breathes. Jonathan's expression doesn't change immediately. but the color drains, almost imperceptibly, from his face. The name remains glowing on the screen. Thomas Caldwell, president of the board. The call is still ringing. The phone rings once more. No one moves to silence it. No one dares. On the massive screen at the front of the boardroom, the name remains illuminated. Thomas Caldwell, president of the board. The sound of the ringing feels louder than it should, echoing against glass and steel and polished wood. Jonathan recovers first, or at least attempts to. "This isn't necessary," he says quietly, stepping forward as if proximity might restore control. "We can schedule—" The ringing stops. The screen shifts, and Thomas Caldwell appears. He is seated in what looks like a private office. Understated, traditional, shelves of leather-bound volumes behind him. No theatrics, no raised voice, just presence. "Good morning," he says calmly. The investors straighten in their chairs almost in unison. "Mr. Caldwell," one of them replies automatically. Thomas nods politely. "I understand this is a live investor session," he continues. "I won't take more time than necessary." His eyes move slightly, scanning the room through the camera. They settle briefly on Jonathan, then on Jessica, then back to the room at large. "I believe you were discussing Project Horizon." The silence that follows is absolute. Jonathan steps closer to the screen. "Yes, Thomas," he says, voice carefully measured. "We're finalizing approval." Thomas tilts his head slightly. "Finalizing," he repeats. A pause. "The board has been reviewing Project Horizon for several weeks." The words fall with controlled weight. Several investors shift in their seats. Jonathan's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. Thomas continues. "During our review, we identified certain inconsistencies in revenue recognition timing related to pending enterprise contracts." The room feels smaller now, more enclosed. Jessica remains standing near the center of the table, hands resting lightly against the back of her chair. She does not look at Jonathan. She watches Thomas. "We requested clarification from executive leadership," Thomas says evenly, "specifically regarding the recognition of revenue prior to formal contractual obligation." One of the private equity investors slowly lowers his pen. Jonathan inhales. "We provided documentation," he interjects smoothly. "The contracts are secured at the executive level, and—" Thomas raises one hand slightly, polite, measured, and completely final. "Jonathan," he says calmly, "the responses we received were incomplete." The interruption is not loud. It is not aggressive. But it lands like a verdict. Thomas continues. "In several instances, the explanations provided did not align with documented contract status. The implication hangs unspoken, evasive." Jonathan opens his mouth again, then closes it. The investors are no longer watching Jessica. They are watching him. Thomas shifts his attention back to the room. "For clarity," he says, "this review did not begin today." He pauses. "It began 3 weeks ago." Shock moves through the boardroom in a visible wave. 3 weeks. Jonathan's eyes flick just once toward Jessica, and in that brief glance, something changes. Calculation, recognition. Thomas continues. "During that time, the board's compliance committee initiated a parallel documentation review." He allows the next sentence to land deliberately. "Ms. Jessica Thompson has been cooperating with that review under established governance protocol." The words settle heavily into the air, a sharp inhale from someone near the far end of the table. Jonathan stares at Jessica now, not with smirk or superiority, with disbelief. Jessica does not meet his gaze. Her face is composed, still. Thomas speaks again. "Her recommendation for an external audit was not spontaneous." He pauses. "It was procedural. The inversion is immediate. Moments ago, she was the junior analyst who didn't understand strategic modeling. Now she is acting under board oversight. Jonathan's composure cracks for the first time. "This is highly irregular," he says, voice tighter than before. "If the board had concerns, this should have been addressed internally, not staged during an investor session." Thomas's expression does not change. "The board did address it internally," he replies, "multiple times." The room goes still again. "We requested clarification," Thomas continues. "We requested documentation. What we received did not resolve our concerns." He lets that breathe. Transparency is not optional. The words carry no heat, only authority. One of the investors clears his throat quietly. "Mr. Caldwell," he says, choosing his words carefully, "are you suggesting the projections are inaccurate?" Thomas does not hesitate. "I am stating," he says, "that revenue appears to have been recognized prior to contractual obligation in a manner inconsistent with standard accounting practice." The phrasing is deliberate, precise, legally contained, but unmistakable. Jonathan steps forward again, abandoning the relaxed posture he had worn so effortlessly before. "These contracts are secured," he insists. "Execution is imminent. Timing adjustments are standard in high-growth environments." Thomas's gaze sharpens slightly. "Anticipation is not execution." The sentence lands cleanly, final. The boardroom has fully shifted now. Investors who had been leaning toward Jonathan earlier are sitting back, re-evaluating. The CFO looks pale. Legal counsel stares down at the table. Thomas folds his hands calmly. "Effective immediately," he says. "The board is suspending final approval of Project Horizon." The words echo. "An independent external audit firm will be appointed within 24 hours. A slow, stunned silence. "And pending the outcome of that audit," Thomas continues, "Jonathan Reed is being placed on temporary administrative leave." The phrase is corporate, controlled, but its meaning is devastating. Jonathan goes completely still. For a moment he says nothing. The confident executive who commanded the room less than an hour ago seems suddenly smaller. "This is a mistake," he says finally, voice low. "You're reacting to incomplete context." Thomas's expression remains calm. "If that is the case," he replies, "the audit will clarify it." There is no anger in his tone, no accusation, just inevitability. Jonathan's eyes move around the room, searching for support. Finding none, the investors avoid his gaze. The executives remain motionless. Power has shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Thomas turns slightly toward Jessica through the screen. "Ms. Thompson," he says, "thank you for your adherence to protocol." She nods once. No smile, no triumph, just acknowledgement. Then Thomas looks back at the room. "I trust everyone understands the gravity of governance obligations. We will communicate next steps formally by end of day." He pauses. "Jonathan, I expect you to coordinate with legal and HR immediately following this meeting." A final beat. "Good morning." The screen goes dark. Silence floods the boardroom. For several seconds, no one speaks. Jonathan remains at the head of the table. The projector light casts a faint glow across his face. The same face that had smirked minutes earlier, now tight, strained. One of the investors clears his throat again. "I think," he says cautiously, "we should adjourn." No one objects. Jonathan slowly sets the presentation remote down. He looks at Jessica, not with anger now, with something closer to disbelief. "You've made a very serious move," he says quietly. Jessica meets his eyes for the first time since the call began. "I followed procedure," she replies. "Nothing more." HR, still standing awkwardly near the doorway, steps forward. "Jonathan," one of them says carefully, "we'll need you to come with us." The words feel surreal in the space. Jonathan hesitates, only for a second, Then he straightens his jacket, regains a fraction of composure. He does not look at the investors again. He walks toward the door. For the first time since the meeting began, he is not leading the room. He is leaving it. The door closes behind him with a soft, controlled click. And just like that, the hierarchy that defined the morning no longer exists. Jessica exhales slowly. She is still standing, still employed, still silent. Around her, the room feels different now. Less certain, more honest. The fracture that appeared earlier has widened into something undeniable. The numbers on the frozen screen no longer look dazzling. They look fragile, and everyone in the room knows it. The headlines didn't explode the next day. There was no dramatic press leak, no cameras outside the building, no viral scandal. Instead, there was silence, the kind that stretches, the kind that makes people inside an organization glance at one another in hallways and lower their voices mid-sentence. Weeks passed. Project Horizon disappeared from internal dashboards. The logo vanished from email signatures. The forward arrow branding that once symbolized acceleration now felt like a misstep no one wanted to acknowledge. On the 16th floor, a different kind of movement began. The external audit firm arrived without ceremony, a team of 5, neutral suits, neutral expressions, laptops instead of presentations. They did not smile much, they requested everything: revenue schedules, contract documentation, internal communications, forecasting models, executive email correspondence. They asked precise questions. When was revenue first entered? Who authorized the timing? Were any objections raised? Were those objections documented? Jessica spent hours in a smaller conference room down the hall, walking them through spreadsheets she knew by memory. Her explanations were clear, restrained, factual. She avoided speculation. She avoided emotion. Across the building, others were not as steady. The CFO's office door stayed closed more often than usual. Legal worked late. Executives who had once spoken confidently about momentum now used words like clarification and process review. The findings did not emerge all at once. They accumulated, line by line, email by email. The first issue was timing. Revenue had been recognized before contractual obligation on multiple occasions, not just the Q4 enterprise contracts Jessica had flagged, but in previous quarters as well. The pattern was subtle at first glance, but unmistakable in sequence. Then came internal communications. One email, sent late on a Sunday night from Jonathan's account, let's align recognition timing with strategic optics. Signatures are a formality. Market confidence matters. Another, delay adjustment entries until next quarter. We need clean acceleration this month. And another, creative timing is not unethical, it's competitive. The phrase circulated quietly among the audit team. Creative timing. It sounded innovative. It wasn't. As interviews continued, a cultural pattern surfaced. Mid-level finance staff described pressure, not overt threats, just expectation. Find a way. Reframe the quarter. Don't stall the narrative. One former analyst admitted that she had raised concerns about contract status months earlier. She was reassigned to another team 2 weeks later. No formal reprimand, just removal from the conversation. Silencing didn't require shouting. It required marginalization. By the 3rd week, the audit firm's preliminary summary was clear: systematic early revenue recognition, internal pressure to inflate quarterly optics, a culture that discouraged financial dissent at senior levels. The board convened on a grey Thursday afternoon. No investors present this time, no polished slide decks, just documentation stacked neatly in front of each board member. Jonathan attended remotely, not by choice. Thomas Caldwell sat at the head of the long table, the same seat Jonathan once occupied during investor sessions. The audit lead presented findings without drama. No adjectives, no judgment, only facts. When the presentation ended, the room was quiet. Jonathan spoke first. "These findings lack contextual nuance," he said evenly. "Forecasting at scale requires strategic interpretation." Thomas looked down briefly at a printed copy of one of the emails. "Creative timing is not unethical. It's competitive," he read aloud. A pause. "Do you stand by that statement?" Silence on the other end of the screen. Jonathan's confidence, once effortless, now sounded measured. "I stand by the intent to protect shareholder value." Thomas nodded once. "The board stands by the obligation to protect governance integrity." The distinction was subtle, but absolute. 2 days later, Jonathan submitted his resignation. The language in the public announcement was carefully constructed. "Stepping down to allow for leadership transition, committed to the company's continued success, appreciative of the opportunity to serve." There was no explicit admission of wrongdoing. There rarely is. But reputational damage travels faster than formal statements. Industry newsletters picked up the leadership shift. Competitors noticed. Recruiters quietly crossed his name off certain lists. In executive circles, the phrase "creative timing" became a cautionary whisper. Inside the company, a formal statement was issued. It emphasized 3 pillars: a commitment to governance reform, strengthening compliance oversight, establishing a new ethics and risk committee reporting directly to the board. Training sessions were scheduled. Internal reporting channels were expanded. Revenue recognition policies were rewritten in clearer, firmer language. But culture is not repaired by policy alone. It is repaired by signals. One morning, Jessica received a calendar invitation marked "Board Session Private." No description, no agenda. She entered the boardroom at 9 a.m. The same 16th floor, the same long walnut table, the Capitol dome visible beyond the glass. Thomas Caldwell was already seated. 2 other board members sat beside him. The room felt different now, less performative, more deliberate. "Good morning, Jessica," Thomas said. She nodded. "Good morning." He did not begin with praise. He did not dramatize what had happened. Instead, he said something simpler. "You followed protocol." She met his gaze. "Yes." He folded his hands. "Many people recognize issues," he continued. "Fewer document them. Fewer still are willing to raise them when it carries personal cost." There was no theatrical gratitude in his tone, only acknowledgement. "The board has voted to formalize the new Governance Oversight Committee," he said. "We would like you to serve on it." Jessica did not respond immediately, not out of shock, but out of awareness. This was not symbolic. This was structural. "You would report directly to the board on financial compliance matters," Thomas continued. "Independent of executive forecasting, a safeguard, a counterweight, a lesson institutionalized." "I accept," she said quietly. Thomas nodded once. "Good." The meeting ended without applause, without ceremony. As Jessica stepped out into the hallway, she paused briefly by the windows. Washington moved below her as it always had, steady, complex, powerful. Weeks earlier, she had stood in this same building under the weight of public termination. She had felt eyes judging her, had heard laughter mistaken for confidence. Now the atmosphere had shifted, not because she had won, but because the structure had changed. Later that afternoon, she entered the boardroom again. This time, she did not stand near the wall. She took a seat at the table, not at the head, not at the far end, but among decision-makers. The walnut surface reflected the city light just as it had before. The chairs were the same, the skyline was the same, but the balance of power felt different, stronger, quieter, One of the board members began reviewing updated compliance protocols. Another referenced new audit checkpoints. Jessica listened carefully. Then, when a projection model was discussed, she spoke. Not cautiously, not defensively, clearly, deliberately. The room listened, not because she demanded it, but because her voice had proven its weight. Outside the glass walls, Washington remained a city of influence and ambition. Inside the 16th floor, something more durable had taken root, a reminder that questioning is not rebellion. It is responsibility, that alignment without integrity is fragility, and that sometimes the strongest leadership does not come from the loudest voice in the room, but from the one willing to speak when silence would be safer.